Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leslie Hughes. I'm the Interim Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Macquarie University, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the Royal Society of New South Wales Clarke Memorial Lecture this evening, to be delivered shortly. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that on behalf of this gathering, we are gathered on the unceded lands of the First Nations people of Australia, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous guests joining us today. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Susan Pond, who is the President of the Royal Society of New South Wales. Susan is AM, FR, SN. She is a distinguished physician whose career spans academia, business and government. She's particularly interested in creating impact by combining disciplines and working at the intersections between them. Susan is chair of the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network, the non-executive director on several listed and unlisted companies, and the council member of the Queensland University of Technology. Welcome, Susan, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Leslie. The Clarke Medal and Lecture were founded in memory of Reverend William Brown-White Clarke, who was an eminent geologist and important figure in the foundation of the Royal Society of New South Wales, which this year is celebrating its 200th anniversary. The first Clarke Memorial Lecture was delivered on the 24th of September 1903 by Professor T.W. Edgeworth David. His address was entitled The Life and Work of the Reverend W.B. Clarke. Distinguished Professor Michelle Leishman was awarded the Clarke Medal and Lecture in 2020. The lecture has been delayed since then because of the pandemic. Even now, we have not been able to hold it in front of a live audience because of public health restrictions. The good news is that Michelle did receive the medal in person at Government House on the 23rd February this year from Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, Governor of New South Wales and patron of the Royal Society of New South Wales. Distinguished Professor Michelle Leishman is an internationally renowned ecologist who works in the fields of plant invasion biology, climate change impacts and adaptation, conservation and urban ecology. She leads a research group in the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie University and is director of the university's Centre for Smart Green Cities. Her research leadership in invasive pests and pathogens has been a driver for national strategies such as the Action Plan for Myrtle Rust in Australia and the Gardening Responsibly initiative. Michelle is a trustee of the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust and chair of the Australian Institute of Botanical Science Advisory Committee. She's also on the board of Bush Heritage Australia and an elected council member of the Australian Flora Foundation. Michelle, I hand over to you to deliver the Royal Society of New South Wales Clarke Lecture for 2020.
Thanks very much, Susan. And I am thrilled. I've been thrilled to have an honour to have been awarded the New South Wales Royal Society Clarke Medal 2020. Sorry that it has taken so long to deliver this lecture, but hopefully it's worth the wait. So I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, water and communities, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully that will work perfectly. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen easily now. So today is St. Patrick's Day, so everything green. So it seems like an appropriate day to be talking about plants, green as they are. And so what I'd like to do today, I've been working in plant ecology and plant conservation biology for a number of years now, and I'm going to give you a bit of a brief overview of some of the work we've been doing, and particularly focusing on plants in terms of the threats that they've had and the sorts of things that we're trying to do in my research group and with my collaborators for urban futures and plant futures. So most of our ecosystems globally are in trouble. And one of them, of course, is habitat destruction. So we have large-scale habitat destruction, both in the terrestrial systems, but also in the areas that we forget to look at underneath the water as well. So in our aquatic and marine systems. In our terrestrial systems, much of the world's grasslands have been converted to agriculture. 80% of our forests have been cleared or degraded. 40% of our tropical rainforests, so there's biodiverse, beautiful tropical rainforests, have been cleared. And if current rates of deforestation continue, the world's biodiverse tropical forests will disappear within 100 years. So that's a fairly scary thought. Of course, in Australia, we are in the same situation as elsewhere in the globe in terms of land clearing. You can see in the figure on the left-hand side, the levels of primary forest loss and tree cover loss in Australia. Some years we are seeing clearing rates of 300,000 hectares, extraordinary rates for a developed country. And you can see the outcome of that in the right-hand side figure, which shows in terms of agri-regions across Australia, they're colour-coded by the amount of vegetation remaining. So the deeper red colours have less than 40% remaining, and the orange and the next colour down is 40 to 50% and so on. So you can see that that effect of forest clearing, land clearing and conversion has been most felt in the southwest of WA, through Victoria and the eastern areas of New South Wales and up into Queensland. And of course, our ecosystems are also facing the stress from climate change. We all know about climate change. You've probably seen many of these scary graphs before. These are graphs from the IPCC's 6th report, which came out at the end of last year, their physical impacts report. So our climate, we know that our average global surface temperatures are rising, and our projections are at 2 degrees global warming. This sort of pattern of annual mean temperature change, so spatially variable across the planet, higher and higher latitudes, and changes in rainfall too. So these are challenging times for our plants and ecosystems. And climate change is not just about changes in average temperatures and average precipitation, but it's also about changes in extremes, which is particularly important for ecosystems. So whether the extremes are more hot weather, more flooding, more intense and frequent bushfires, all of those are challenging conditions for our plants. And we're certainly seeing that in terms of drought. We're seeing large, extensive canopy dieback in parts of Australia. So from places like the Monaro woodlands, Monaro region in Australia, that's a pretty depressing landscape. Parts of Victoria through the North England, New England tablelands. So quite extensive canopy dieback due to the drought that we had recently. It's hard to remember after all this rain and flooding that we've had, but those droughts were recent and they'll come back. And the third of the triple whammies that hits our plants and ecosystems, of course, are invasive species. So I've worked on invasive plant species for a number of years now, and I'm going to spend a bit of this talk focusing on invasive species, their impacts and what we can do about them. So we have introduced exotic plant species around the world. That's part of the aspect of globalization. And we've introduced them into our marine environments. We've introduced them into our aquatic environments, such as our wetlands. This is water hyacinth that invades every continent apart from Antarctica. We've introduced them into our coastal regions. This is bitu bush we're so familiar with along our beaches. And many of these species outcompete or smother vegetation. So they have direct impacts on our native plant species and native habitats. Some of them have indirect impacts as well, so more subtle impacts. So this is an example of an Australian acacia. This is Acacia saligna that's been introduced into the Fenbos region of the Southern Cape region of South Africa. It changes the biofrequency. So it encourages and facilitates hotter and more frequent burning, which has ecosystem cascade effects. Similarly, in Northern Territory, we've introduced African gamba grass. It creates this enormous amount of biomass and supports very hot and intense fires. And that has substantially changed, has cascading effects, again, onto the ecosystem. And some species have changed to catchment hydrology. This is apple pine, introduced in Central Australia, and has invaded, for example, along the Finke River. It's changed the water yield and catchment hydrology. So direct and indirect impacts on ecosystems. So our plant species under these triple whammies of land clearing and climate change and invasive species, many are facing extinction. So globally, the IUCN puts together the red list of species under threat. So far, they've assessed about 60,000 plant species, which is less than a third of the known plant species recorded. But these are the sorts of numbers that they've come up with. So 120 species reported as extinct, critically endangered, somewhat over 5,000, and in the endangered and vulnerable classes are just under 10,000 each. So that's only about less than 30% of known plant species that have been assessed. It's still a large number, but you can do interesting statistical and work with that database to make up for the spatial and collecting biases that we know are within these sorts of collections. And the number comes out at about 40% of global plant species under threat. In Australia, we are very lucky. We have an unbelievably beautiful flora. It's globally distinctive. We have over 22,000 plant species on the continent. More than 90% are endemic. So that means that more than 90% of the plant species, our native plant species, occur in Australia and nowhere else. We even have, of our plant families, 14 of them are endemic. So our flora is all sorts of things. Our pea, a myriad of peas and wattles. We have our iconic gums and bottle brushes in the Myrtaceae family. We have our daisy family, the Asteraceae. We have the amazing and extraordinary Proteaceae family, such as our Banksias and Grevilleas. We have our heathland species like our Epacrids. We have some quite extraordinary diversity of orchids. We have trees such as our pine trees, as pencil pine in central highlands of Tasmania, and our desert species like spinifex that occurs nowhere else, and nothing else is like it anywhere in the world, desert pea, things like that. So we're really lucky we have this extraordinary diversity of plant species on the continent, and we need to look after them. But like the rest of the world, some of our species are in trouble. So this is a snapshot from the New South Wales State of Environment report for 2021. So we have a bit over 4,500 plant species recorded within New South Wales, and about 14% of those are listed as threatened. Some are recorded as extinct, some critically endangered, and about a bit over 300 as endangered. The numbers, of course, for these sorts of lists are always underestimates because we cannot systematically go through every single species, check it all. It's a huge amount of data and resources, but this gives us a bit of a snapshot and an indicator of what's going on. And there's a lot of reasons why they've been driven towards extinction. It's land clearing, it's climate change, and it's invasive plants. And most of our threatened plants and ecosystems are impacted by some combination of those stresses. Almost all of them have exotic invasive species as the impact. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about exotic invasive species and some of the work that we've done to understand the impacts and to understand why they've become invasive and problematic, and to show you some of the resources that we've developed to help us deal with that. So exotic plant species can impact native species richness and community composition. Not all exotic species do. In fact, the large majority are fairly benign and either don't escape and become invasive or just add into the community and don't do very much. But some really are problematic and can drive down and outcompete and smother native vegetation and change the habitat for fauna as well. Some of them are particularly spectacular, and we call them transformer species. So African olive is a good example of this. African olive was introduced from Africa, South Africa, not surprisingly, but given the name. And here it is here at Mount Annan on the slopes of Mount Annan. It's this very solid monoculture of African olive. Hardly anything can grow underneath it. It's very dense, shady canopy. And you'll be pleased to hear that actually a lot of this is now being cleared. This is a photo from some years ago, but it takes a lot of work to clear it and to restore the native Cumberland plain woodland underneath. So we did some work a number of years ago where we looked from the African olive canopy out through the edge, out into the woodland. So African olive abundance declines, of course, as you go from the African olive canopy out into the woodland. And if you do the same transect and you are looking at percent cover of native species, there's very few under the African olive canopy, and it rises and increases as you go out through the edge and out into the woodland. So clear evidence of the impact of this particular species on the native flora. So how come some species, when they're introduced to a new place, do super well and become problematic and others don't? And I'm going to show you just snippets of evidence about the main reasons why some species become a problematic invader. So one of them is release from pests and pathogens. And the argument is that when you put a species in a new place, it leaves behind its pests and pathogens that have been controlling its population size, and the playing ground, the playing field is now unequal, and they have a bit of an edge over native species who have a load of pests and pathogens. We tested this in a very fun project where we looked at a range of species, about 14 species that were native to either New Zealand, Australia, East or West Australia, or South Africa, and had invaded at least 2 of those regions outside their own native region. So we had the Western Cape of South Africa, we have Western Australia, where all of these are our sampling points in Eastern Australia, and this is New Zealand sampling points. So we sampled nearly 300 populations in these areas, traveling around. This is my colleague, Julia Cook, who did a lot of the field work very safely, standing on top of vehicles, measuring things. And for example, one of the things that we found was that the leaf damage for all of those species in the native range was much higher, these grey bars, compared to in the exotic range, the dark bars. So the species appear to be freed from their pests and pathogens. It's a bit of an unequal playing field. Exotic species also do particularly well when environmental conditions are different than for the native species. So for example, in the Sydney region, we have very low fertility soils. Our sandstone soils are very low in fertility. Our native species are adapted to it, and exotic species don't do very well. But when we change those conditions, so when we introduce nutrients, like through stormwater outlets like this one, then suddenly we've tipped the balance, and the exotic species are much happier. That's the conditions they're used to, and our native species are not quite so happy. So here's some data where we looked at the relationship between the proportion of exotic species in terms of their cover and soil total phosphorus, and there's a very clean, clear, nice linear relationship. The more phosphorus there is in the soil, the larger proportion of exotic plant cover that you have. And it's so easy to see if you're in the field, if you're underneath one of these stormwater outlets or along a creek that receives nutrient-rich stormwater. It's weedy. You step away from where the nutrient enrichment is, and it's dominated by native species. Another factor that affects whether or not species exotics will do well is their traits. How well, what are their traits that help them to do well in a new environment? And if you're going to be an invasive species, you need to move around the landscape, you need propagules and lots of them. And many of our exotic species produce a huge amount of seeds or fruits. Pampas grass, each one of these plumes is 100,000 seeds. This is large-leaf privet. It's producing thousands of seeds per metre squared of canopy. So we know, we can look at them, we know what's going on. What we did was we pulled together data on seed production from the literature. The filled squares, the filled circles are exotic species and the open ones are native species. Now, it doesn't look like there's much of a pattern, but this is on the log scale. And actually what this is showing us is that the seed production, the number of seeds produced per individual per year of exotic species is 7 times that per seed mass, per unit of seed mass compared to native species. So they're producing more seeds, which helps them to disperse around and become invasive. And then when they get there into those changed environmental conditions, the exotic species that do well have the sorts of traits that enable them to grow quickly and outcompete other species. So this is some data which we've looked at the characteristics based on leaf level characteristics that indicate fast growth. So the nitrogen content of the leaves and the specific leaf area, the higher you are up in the right-hand corner of this graph, then the more capacity you have for fast growth. They're the traits that let you grow quickly. So we have species with these, the green upside down triangles are exotic species like this balloon vine, grow really, really quickly. The species in the middle, the orange circles are native species which have which do well in these changed environmental conditions, and the brown circles down here are native species which don't do so well. They like the limited soil phosphorus, for example, such as our Banksias. So those exotic species that have traits that enable rapid growth so that they can, once they get somewhere with their great dispersal, they can grow really quickly and outcompete the native species. And we can test this in the glasshouse. We grow species, natives and exotics. We manipulate the conditions in terms of nutrients and water. And what we see is these exotic invasive species here do really well. Their biomass is much, much better than when they're grown in controlled or just water added conditions. The nutrients really allow them to take off much more than the native non-invasive species. It makes much less difference to their biomass. All right, so that's exotic invasive plant species on their own. But what happens when we throw a spanner in the works and we add climate change into the mix? So with climate change, we can see shifts in distribution of a species range as the climate changes. We expect species to move southwards, polewards, and uphills is a sort of easy and simplistic way of thinking about it. So species, as the climate changes, can move into areas where they weren't able to occur before. They may also be found to be, as the climate changes, suddenly in places that are not so suitable for them. So there may be contractions of climatically suitable areas. And for some species, we have nearly 3,000 species here in Australia that are exotic, that are what we call naturalized species. So they're not invasive, they're self-sustaining populations, but they're not really going anywhere. Or perhaps when we change the climate around them, they might be woken up and off they go. So we call them sleeper weeds. So we've done a lot of this type of bioclimatic modelling. This is for one particular species, and we can model areas of climate suitability under current climates and under future climates, and get a species by species look at what's going on the potential for how those species might cope as the climate changes. And we can also overlay those results and look at it for lots and lots of species. And I'll show you what we've done in a tool just in a few slides further on. Now, I mentioned before about extreme climatic events. That's one of the components of climate change. And the bioclimatic modelling that we do copes less well with the frequency of extreme events. It's more about average changes. But when we think about extreme events such as flooding and bushfires, and hurricanes, then the species that will do well in the areas once the damage has been done are those that have the ability to disperse across the landscape. And I've shown you then already that exotic species are really good at that. They've got lots and lots of propagules. And also those that are good at taking advantage of open space. So the ones that can grow rapidly and outcompete. So again, I've shown you that exotic species often have those sorts of traits. So they're kind of primed to do well after an extreme event, such as a fire or a hurricane. So we tested this in the glasshouse. It's kind of hard to test extreme events in glasshouses, but we did our best, and we grew a mesocosms of native species, native grass species, and then subjected them to a drought. So we dropped the soil water content down. So the lower it is, then the less native species biomass there is. And we dispersed seeds of an exotic species, Erhata, and we looked to see how well those Erhata seedlings did, how well they could establish given the different amounts of native species biomass. And so the less native grass biomass there was, the better that Erhata did, right? So it's like making a little extreme event in the glasshouse, impose the drought, look what happens, and the invaders are able to get in and have a foothold. And then finally, with climate change, there's one other thing, which is the CO2 effect. So plants basically do better when there's more CO2. That's sort of what we find over lots and lots of species. That's the average response. But the thing is, does elevated CO2 actually help invasive species more than it helps native species? And the sorts of species that do well with additional CO2 are those fast-growing species. And that, of course, is what I've already shown you, is what many of our exotic species that have done so well are. So we've done lots of experiments of elevated CO2, and we've shown that competitive ability of the exotics compared to natives is enhanced under elevated CO2. We've shown that their resprouting response is enhanced. So we've done lots of individual experiments, and then our experiments plus other experiments done across the globe have been pulled together in a big meta-analysis to look at comparisons of performance of native versus invasive species under what sorts of conditions do they do better. And elevated CO2 is one of them. So as we increase our CO2 concentration, we're again tipping the balance a little bit towards invader species. So when we pull that all together, what does it actually mean? So my call on invasive plant species under climate change is that as we reduce vegetation resilience, so as we hammer our native vegetation with land clearing and with climate change and with all of the other stresses that we impose, and that which creates increased bare ground and increased colonization opportunities, that in combination with the traits that invaders typically have, so capacity to disperse really well, capacity for fast growth, that combination of those two things means that we are likely to see a shift to exotic dominated plant assemblages under future climate. So what can we do? How should we think about this? What should our response be in terms of management? Well, one is that we can embed strategies for targeting, for targeted eradication of exotic species after extreme events. So making sure that our post-fire bush regen focuses on exotic species. And we can use all sorts of tools and technologies available now, whether it's drones or LiDAR and so on, to spot these species in ecosystems. So being very careful after extreme events. We have to worry about people with flooding, get them safe, build their houses, but look for the weeds as well. And this is something that we've built. This is the Weed Futures website. It is a decision support tool that provides users with the ability to look for individual weed species and how well they will do under future climates, and also to look by region and see what sorts of species and the number of different exotic species that will do well under future climate in particular regions. So we're very proud of this tool. It's more than 700 species in there. It's very useful for natural resource managers And it was a finalist in the Eureka Awards a couple of years ago. There's Leslie and myself and my better half glamming it up at the Eureka Awards, which was one of the fun bits of it as well. And here is another tool. This is a much more recent one. This one is about to come out in the next rollout as a trial in the next month or so. So this is the Gardening Responsibly Plant Sure scheme. And my team at Macquarie have built the weed risk assessment, which is the foundation of this, and it's got climate change built into it. So we've built the plant risk assessment tool. It assesses all the ornamental plant species that are for sale in the industry, and it's basically like dolphin-friendly tuna, right? It's an eco accreditation green tick scheme. And the low-risk invasive species will have a green tick. So when you go into your local nursery in the coming months and years, make sure you look for those species that have a green tick on the label because they're accredited as being a low invasion risk. Okay, so I'm going to switch to a quick flick from invasive plants to invasive pathogens and talk to you about myrtle rust. So there's two invasive pathogens that are particularly problematic for Australian plants and vegetation, and they are Phytophthora and myrtle rust. So we've done some work on myrtle rust for a couple of years now. Myrtle rust is a plant pathogen. It originates from South America. It causes these yellow pustules on growing green shoots and flowers and fruits of species, and it only affects species in the Myrtaceae family. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, the Myrtaceae family, we have over 2,000 species of Myrtaceae in Australia, and they are our iconic species. There are gum trees, there are paperbarks, there are bottle brushes. Imagine in Australia without those things. It is hard to imagine. So this is the occurrence of myrtle rust. It was introduced first recorded in New South Wales in 2010. So it's only been a bit more than a decade, and it has spread very rapidly along the East Coast and is now in the Tiwi Islands and Lord Howe and now New Zealand. And it has this impact on individual plants. It can cause stress and mortality sometimes, and dieback of canopies, which then of course has flow-on ecosystem effects. So you can imagine after fire, you get these little regenerating seedlings and they all get smashed by myrtle rust. We've got a bit of a problem. So what we did was we mapped myrtle rust in terms of its climate suitability under current climates and under future climates using that same bioclimatic modelling approach. And then we overlapped these maps with the occurrence records of more than 2,000 Myrtaceous species in Australia. And that enabled us to identify those species that were at risk now and under future climates. So because we could look at the extent of overlap of the myrtle rust range and that species range. If they didn't overlap, then it was unlikely to be a problem. If there's more than 90% range of the species overlap, likely to be a problem. But the other things that we needed to know about were the susceptibility of the species. Not all Myrtaceous species are affected by the pathogen, and so we compiled that data on susceptibility. And we also compiled the data on the threat status. So were those plant species endangered already before myrtle rust got here? And we could use all of that information together to prioritise species for conservation. So based on their susceptibility, on the range overlap, and on their threat status. And that sort of information was key to this. So this was produced a couple of years ago. This is the Myrtle Rust in Australia National Action Plan. So it's a national plan for coordinated approach across the states and the Commonwealth. And so far there's nearly 400 native plant species that have been recorded as susceptible. It means that myrtle rust has now gone onto those national lists that really matter for making things happen. So once it's on the national priority list, then there's more strict biosecurity controls and so on to prevent the arrival of new strains of myrtle rust, and increasing research to understand susceptibility and resistance, both within species and across among different species. Okay, so I'm going to do the last couple of minutes or so, I'm going to do a bit of a switch and talk about climate smart urban greening in our cities. So this is what I've been working on for the last couple of years. It's got the same climate readiness theme running through it, but instead of being in native ecosystems and natural ecosystems, I've been focusing on urban ecosystems. Okay, so our cities are getting hotter. We know that, we're experiencing that ourselves. Well, not so much this summer, but give us another summer or two and we'll be back complaining about the heat. So cities are hot anyway because of the urban heat island effect. This is where the heat gets trapped basically by the built environment, and we find that temperatures are hotter in the centre of cities compared to the outskirts. And on top of that, we have climate change. So our cities are getting hotter. This is some data from a study that was published by ACF last year. So heat waves are getting hotter, they're lasting longer, they occur more often. So in Sydney, here in Sydney, heat wave days are starting nearly 3 weeks earlier. In Brisbane, they start about a week earlier. In Canberra, the number of heat wave days have more than doubled. In Adelaide, the hottest heat wave day is 4 degrees, more than 4 degrees hotter. So it's getting hotter, we know this. But one of the nature-based solutions to this urban heat are our urban green spaces. So they provide cooling. This is an aerial photograph of an area of Parramatta, and here is the heat map for exactly the same area. So these areas with all these dark roofs and not much green are the hottest areas, and these areas here of green are where we find the cooler areas when we look at the heat map. So urban greening helps to provide urban cooling. We need to understand this as well as we can so that we can design our urban green spaces to provide us with the best cooling possible. So this is some work that we did in Adelaide. So this is with Adapt West, which is a group of councils in Adelaide. And what we did was we waited for a heat wave and we strapped some instrumentation underneath a light aircraft and flew over the suburbs and recorded land surface temperatures as well as imagery of the areas. And what we found was this is land surface temperature here, and this is land cover of these different components. So the more of this brown stuff, which is non-vegetation you have, then the hotter those land surface temperatures are. And then the green cools it down, but it's different. Grass is different to trees. So the grass cover will cool down those extreme temperatures a couple of degrees, but the tree canopy cover cooled it down as much as 6 degrees. So that makes a difference. You think of the difference between 44 and 38. Yep, 38 is still hot, but it's much better than 44. So it's important that we understand exactly how much urban cooling we get from our urban green space and the configuration of the green space. And one of the things that we found was that residential gardens are really important. When we talk about urban greening, it's all about public space and street trees and things like that. But actually our residential gardens are really important too. So 20% of the land area that we looked at was residential gardens, but that had 40% of the tree cover. And our urban green spaces are important, not just for cooling, that they provide all these other benefits as well. So they intercept rainfall and they help us manage our stormwater so we don't get the peakiness of those floods. They take up carbon and store carbon, so there's a climate change mitigation. They trap air pollutants on their foliage, so we have better human thermal comfort, better air quality, and as well energy saving benefits for our buildings and so on. And really, really importantly, they are a home for our biodiversity. So in Sydney, our urban green spaces support carpal owls, which are a threatened species, a whole range of reptiles and amphibians, this green tree frog, enormous amounts of biodiversity. And of course, they also support us as humans in terms of our physical and mental health and well-being. And we're getting a lot more interest from after COVID, when everybody was stuck in their neighbourhoods. suddenly they wanted to escape their houses and get into urban green space, and discovered whether or not they had it nearby or how valuable it was. And we're seeing all sorts of interest in terms of understanding about heat and what it, how it affects learning, for example, in our schools. And we're seeing urban forest strategies being developed in local government areas all across Australia. In New South Wales, we have 2 premier priorities that are focused on urban greening and increasing canopy cover. But some of our common species are really feeling the heat. So this is after a heat wave in 2018. This is a plane tree. Plane trees seem particularly susceptible. This is old man Banksia, Banksia serrata. I always think of this as being a really tough species, but actually really doesn't like these extreme temperatures at all. So really scorched, brown looking, and all of those benefits from urban green space that we talked about. So air pollutant, cooling benefits, biodiversity benefits, and so on. If they're all scorched and brown and not doing super well, these species, then we're not getting all of those benefits that we're looking for. Now, some of you may remember Sydney in the 4th of January 2020, when it got to 48.9 degrees at Penrith, hottest place on the planet at that time, and our trees hated it. So we did a street tree survey. We looked at over 5,500 trees on the streets of Penrith, and we scored them for their foliage damage. And this is the top. This is a grab from that, the graph showing the results there. So the more on the left it is with the darker colours, the more foliage damage there was. And the species that really copped the damage were largely the exotic deciduous species. So we've got a list of species that are particularly vulnerable to heat, some of our native species, but the large majority were those exotic deciduous species. Not surprising, they've come from the northern hemisphere, cooler climates in the main. So we need to understand which species can cope with the changing climatic conditions. So there's some things that we can do to build the resilience of our urban forests. So one is to choose our species carefully. So to make sure that we don't end up with these horrible brown landscapes. This is actually on the Macquarie campus. This garden has been completely replanted, but totally cooked with those hot days. So we need careful species selection. We need to be able to find species that tolerate low water availability and extreme heat. And we also basically need to put all of our eggs not in the one basket, but to spread them a bit more. So we need to diversify the species within our urban forests. So this word cloud here represents a database of street trees that are planted in 60 local government areas across Australia. So there's 1.2 million records in the database that represent about 1,200 species. So 1,200 species, you go, that's a lot of different species we have in our urban forest. But it's these ones here in the big letters that are the ones that are dominant. That's what there's most of. Lophostomen, Eucalyptus leucoxylon, Callistemon biminalis, and so on. And so those top 30 species in our urban forests across all of Australia make up over half of the urban forest, right? So we're putting our eggs into too few baskets. We need to spread our risk, and we need to increase the diversity of urban forests. So in the Witch Plant Ware project that we've been doing for the last couple of years, we've been screening species in the glass houses for heat and drought tolerance. So we have nice conditions, watering conditions, and then some of them we are under these drought conditions, and we drive the soil water down to very low levels. And then when it's in drought conditions, then we hit them with a heat wave. So it's the torture chambers up in the plant growth facility at the university. And then we compile that data with information about the plant characteristics and as well as their physiology, and put them into groups, put plants into groups of drought tolerance and also heat tolerance. And this sort of data we have put into a new tool that we've developed and we're about to launch, which is the Witch Plant Ware online tool. So this is an online tool that we've developed for the urban greening profession. It enables users to search by location or to search by species and to use a number of different filters. And it is backed up with a database of over 2,500 species. So there's 2,500 species in the tool, species, cultivars and varieties. And the tool enables a user to come in and to work out for any particular postcode a list of climatically suitable species. So it's got climate suitability in relation to postcode for 2,500 species. And for each species that comes up, there's information about its climatic suitability now and under future climates, but also a lot of information about its environmental tolerances generally, its appearance, what it's used for, and so on. And then urban greening professionals can put together a plant species list of climatically suitable species. They can calculate the canopy area that it will provide. They can calculate the planting diversity that it gives them, and they can calculate shade and carbon and biodiversity values. So backed up by a whole lot of information about the science that underpins the tool, and a whole lot of resources about climate change, about building resilient urban landscapes, about monitoring and maintenance of your urban forest, and community engagement and so on. So a whole lot of blog articles and resources and best practice guidelines. So what are we doing in the future? So we've worked out the climate suitability in terms of glasshouse testing and bioclimatic modelling, but we really need to test them in the field. So we're developing urban forest demonstration sites. So this is Samia tagging our plants that are about to go in the ground out of the Mount Annan Botanical Garden urban forest site, where we're testing the plant performance in relation to recycled water and soil amendments. And we have another one also going in out at Mount Annan, where we're testing climatic provenances of species and different soil amendments as well to increase drought and heat tolerance. So watch this space. We hope to get really interesting outcomes from those over the next number of years. So I just want to finish up just a quick sort of reflection about what this means. I hope it hasn't been too much of a doom and gloom about what's going on with our plants and our vegetation, but to show you that there's tools and resources and lots of people thinking about this and trying to find ways to tackle and to help our natural resource managers. And basically a bit of a call that one of the things that we really need is active and brave management. So by that I mean not just to watch species go extinct, but to be brave and to try new things and to not let perfection be the enemy of good. We need to be a bit brave and try all sorts of things, and not just one thing, but lots of different things. So simple things. To increase resilience to climate change, we need to alleviate the other sorts of stresses, the invasive competition from invasive species, changes in environmental conditions like nutrient enrichment and so on. So make the vegetation as resilient as possible. We need to have connectivity across our landscape so that species can disperse across the landscape. We need to be brave and translocate species to new climatically suitable regions. We need to undertake active landscape management. So whether that's moving species around, connecting landscapes, making sure that the water is in the right place in the landscape, even soft engineering solutions. We need to identify and protect climate refugia for our species. And when we're doing restoration, we should not think about restoration. We're never going to get our vegetation back to how it was before. We need to be thinking forward. How can we make sure that the trajectory of vegetation dynamics ends up where we want it to be? So using climate-ready revegetation approaches, using climate-ready suitable species. And we need to manage genetic diversity and adaptive capacity of species. So there's all sorts of interesting things that we can do for restoration, and even using our urban spaces, for example, for seed production areas. Can we use our golf courses for seed production areas that are genetically diverse and climatically suitable? So all sorts of different ideas for of how we can cope with such a changing vegetation and plant species resilience under those triple whammies of climate change, clearing, and invasive pests and pathogens. So I'd just like to end by acknowledging that so many people work on this with me through the years. so many different postdocs and students and colleagues and collaborators, and thanks to all of them. And I'm very happy to take questions during the Q&A session.
Thanks, Michelle. That was a really enlightening talk. If anyone would like to post some questions about this talk, please post it in the Q&A session. We do have a few minutes for questions. We have had some questions, Michelle, relating to your urban greening work. So Oscar asks, are there requirements by private developers to ensure urban greening is part of their development plans? So for example, large housing developments in Western Sydney.
Yes, so there are. So these come down to mostly at the local council level, but some of it is also at the state government level, depending on if it's a precinct level plan. So yes, there's an amount of, there are relationships between impervious and impervious surfaces, where pervious surfaces are usually green space. And there's increasing interest in canopy cover. So the state government has a very clear target of increased canopy cover, and that rolls out into local government planning as well. So increasing their canopy cover wherever they can, residential gardens, encouraging residential urban green space too. So what we want is to make sure that that urban green space that is developed is actually resilient and climate ready. And there has been some interesting, the Department of Planning have required in some areas, for example, in the Camden area, I think it is, that new developments have to have a garden that is big enough to take one tree in the front and one tree out the back. So a large tree. So there are some moves, but land is precious, land's worth money. And so the trade-off between urban green space and built space is always a bit traumatic.
Yeah. And another question is there any research being done on how urban tree cover relates for socioeconomic status of an area and how this then relates to health outcomes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's evidence from overseas about this as well, but it's certainly true. We know within our Australian areas and certainly here in Sydney that tree canopy cover is higher in the higher socioeconomic areas. So it's partly a nature of being closer to the coast and larger housing blocks and things like that. But there's clearly a relationship between the amount of green cover and socioeconomic status. And part of the, and this is a compounding issue, right? So in the western suburbs of Sydney, it's hot, there's less green cover, and there's also less capacity for people to pay their energy bills to air condition. And, and it's hotter because temperatures are hotter anyway, and plus there's less green cover to cool it down. So there's increasing recognition of the social inequality associated with spatial variation in urban green space.
Yeah. Another question is, so this one specifically about the Witch Plant Wear project.
Mm-hmm. You can answer this one, Samia.
I don't think so. What sort of proportion, so the species that are recommended by the Witch Plant Wear project, what sort of proportion are out of range? So for example, they're being recommended for Sydney, but that's further south than their previous natural distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So what sort of species, I guess the proportion of species that are shifting in their range?
Yeah. So so the Witch Plant Wear, there's 2,500 species, as I mentioned. About 3/4 of them are native to Australia, and the rest of them are exotic species. None of them are weed species, I promise, we promise. But they are ornamental exotics of low risk. Now, the data is not there to bring it down to the local Indigenous level. So at the postcode level, we don't say that it's native to that postcode, we say that it's native to Australia. So a lot of the recommendations will be for species that are from different locations, but that's kind of part of what we're planning to do. Urban areas are relatively low risk for invasion risk into our natural ecosystems, and plus the individual species are low risk. So we are not worried about introducing a lot of species into that will disturb natural ecosystems. It's more about making sure that the urban green spaces are diverse and resilient to climate change.
Yep. So hopefully what we're planting isn't going to be take off and become a garden escape.
No. So we've put in our safeguards about that in terms of them being low risk for invasion. And that will correspond with that plant shore project as well, with the ornamental risk assessment tool.
Yeah. All right. So now we have a question on invasive species. So is there an established relationship between the number of exotic species in an environment and the rate of success of invasion? So as in, does an exotic species invade more successfully if surrounded by more non-native species in that environment?
Okay. So it's a kind of complicated answer because it depends on the spatial scale, essentially. So at local scales, so at the scale of a plot of a couple of square meters or in on your local patch of bushland, then diversity matters. So at the regional scale, the more native species there are, the more exotic species there are. Okay. But at the local scale, it works the other way around, where the more native species there are, the less exotic species there are, so that the native species are presumably providing some sort of competitive interaction and barrier to exotic invasion. Once you change those conditions, of course, you turn the tables around and throw a spanner in the works and throw the cards in the air and everything can be different. So it's a complicated answer because it depends on the spatial scale.
Right. Okay, so we've had a few more questions in the chat, but we are running out of time. So hopefully we can answer those later. So I'll pass it now on to Leslie for the concluding remarks of this webinar.
Thanks very much, Samia. Well, as a fellow ecologist and friend and colleague and collaborator of Michelle's for many years, dare I say decades, it's been personally wonderful to hear her describe such a broad spectrum of her vast body of research tonight. And it's been a sobering listen, of course, and the environmental problems that Michelle described are truly immense. But of course, to solve these problems, we need to understand them deeply. And I think anybody listening to Michelle tonight will understand that the work that she has done with her team is absolutely critical for meeting those challenges. And to underpin, of course, what she calls brave management. So I think everybody will agree that Michelle is an incredibly deserving winner of this prestigious award. So thank you, Michelle, for a wonderful speech. And now I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And I certainly hope we don't have to wait another 2 years for the next Clarke Memorial Medal lecture. Thank you, everyone, and good night.